On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being smooth sailing and 10 being utter destruction, where would you place America? Where would you place the state of America's freedoms right now? I would say hitting 9, well on its way to 10. And that's the topic of today's discussion on Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Reminding you that not only can you get Bold and Blunt at WashingtonTimes.com, not only can you subscribe to my 3 times a week newsletter at WashingtonTimes.com, by going to my hyperlinked name, clicking on it, scrolling to the bottom, and finding the directions to sign up for my Monday, Wednesday, and Friday newsletters delivered right into your email box with all my commentaries and my twice weekly Bold and Blunt podcasts. Not only that, but you can also get my podcast, my Bold and Blunt podcast, by going to edify.app/podcasts. That's edifi.app/podcasts. That is the platform for Christian-based podcasts. So check it out. Check out Bold and Blunt there, along with all the other great podcasts from a Christian worldview to help you get through these dark, bleak times. These dark, bleak 9 going on 10 times. So seriously, 1 to 10. Do you think America's liberties are still intact? Do you think we have little to nothing to worry about? Or do you think that maybe sometimes it's half and half, sometimes the Democrats go a little bit too far, sometimes maybe even conservatives, the Republican Party, goes a little bit too far, leaning toward the collectivism, away from the individualism, away from the God-given freedoms upon which this nation was built? Or do you think that we're really hitting at hard, dark times right now? I think peril is the word that comes to mind when I think of America's individual liberties. And there are many reasons for it. First, let me give you a pastor's perspective. Charles Stanley is one of the nation's great, most committed, longest-serving pastors. And daily, weekly, consistently, he delivers spot-on messages about biblical perspectives and how they play out in modern day society. Take a listen to this. This was from 2016.
To be in peril is to be in danger. To be in a perilous position is to be in a hazard-threatening position. And while we love what we see going on in many ways, we are in a very dangerous position as an American.
Yep.
And the question is, what are people doing about it? Well, so many people are blind to the truth.
Absolutely.
They don't see it.
Nope, don't see it.
They are asleep. They don't feel it. And some just don't care
See no
about
evil,
what happens in this country.
hear no evil.
And many of us have lived long enough to know what it used to be like. It doesn't mean that you live in the past. It means that you gauge today by the past.
Yep.
This is one of the most dangerous times in the life of our nation.
Agree.
All you have to do is look around and see what's happening. See where we have been, see where we are, and see where we will be if we continue on the present route and there is no change.
That's the big question, right? Where are we headed in America? What Charles Stanley is talking about is looking at the waymarks of where America used to be, beginning with the context of America's founding, the great exceptionalism that courses through America's DNA and what it's based upon, which, in just a few words, is the concept of God-given rights. It's the concept of individualism. It's the idea that as an individual born in this country, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are only instituted among men and women to secure those rights, to protect those rights. Now in this country, it's become flipped and flopped. It's become the government's role to give rights as as government sees fit, to choose the winners of these rights versus the losers of these rights, to give and take as government sees fit. That is a perilous position. And that is where America now stands. If you go back to America's founding and the great notion upon which we were founded of God-given liberties, where government is only there to protect what is inherent in each citizen born into this country, and look at where we are now, where we have government giving us the right to walk about freely without a face mask, government giving us the right to enter a restaurant without showing a vaccine passport to the restaurant owner, government giving us the right to go to church, to sing in church even, Governor Gavin Newsom in California, government giving us the right to provide for self and family by going to work at will instead of sitting at home and waiting for the stimulus check to come in the mail. The flipping and the flopping of the proper role of citizen to public servant in this country has come to a perilous position. Pastors know it. Some pastors know it. Pundits in the news know it. Some pundits in the news know it. Authors know it. Some authors know it. My guest today, both pundit and author, Victor Davis Hanson, he knows it. He's written an excellent new book pointing out just these perilous times as a way of educating people and opening their eyes to the truths of what's happening. These things that have gone forth in America in the last year, year and a half even, due to the coronavirus, due to the Democrats' usage of the coronavirus in order to exert controls that are more often than not unconstitutional, these things are not happening by coincidence. These things are happening as part of a strategic takeover by the left of America, of America's Constitution, of America's very existence and foundation. This is a strategic time for the socialists / progressives / communists / Marxists / Bolsheviks / collectivists. They're all collectivists. Call them what you want. In the end, the path is collectivism. And that stands in steadfast opposition, in staunch opposition to individualism, the core concept of America. So look, the question is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to fight this takeover from within? If only America were to be attacked by an enemy of foreign nature, if only America were to be taken over by an army of, say, Chinese or North Koreans or some other force, then we could see the enemy in our backyards. We could whip out our Second Amendment tools and fight the enemy. But the perilous time in America right now is the fact that the enemy is sneaky and subtle and cultural and societal and coursing through our education system and bent on infiltrating our youth's minds with propaganda that puts down capitalism, that puts down free markets, that puts down America and elevates communism and collectivism. That's the real peril facing America right now. The enemy from within, working within the systems, within the institutions already established in America to undercut and destroy those very systems and institutions. And do it in a way that most Americans don't even notice. Most Americans have their eyes closed to the threat. And even those Americans who are onto the threat that's taking place right now, even those Americans who are aware of the perilous position in which America now sits, most are struggling in effective fighting. how to fight and win. Who is the enemy right now in America? You know, in World War II, you could name the enemy. You could see the enemy. You could fight the enemy. You could shoot at the enemy. But how can you shoot at an enemy that takes the shape of a young teenage kid in a Walmart standing at the door demanding that everybody who enters put a face mask on? How can you fight the enemy who is a restaurant owner who, in order to keep his or her business open, to provide food for his or her own family, to provide income and financial stability for his or her own family, abides and obeys the local government's mandate to force customers to show proof of vaccine, of coronavirus vaccine, as a condition of entering and eating there? Is that restaurant owner the enemy? Is that teenage boy or girl working at Walmart the enemy? Not really. The enemy is the internal system that brought about the atmosphere in America where these things, these mandates, these regulatory controls, these infringements on individual freedoms have become not just norm, but accepted. The go along to get along way of living. Nobody wants to rock the boat, so put the face mask on. Thankfully, we're seeing some pushback. Thankfully, we've got police unions and firefighters out there, and In-N-Out Burger restaurant owners fighting the unconstitutional vaccine mandates. We have people out there in America seeing this perilous position where the government takes total control of all human behaviors, of all individual freedoms. And they're fighting back. They're putting it out there. They're putting it all on the line for yours and my freedoms and the freedoms of our children. They're quitting jobs. They're staying out of work. They're filing lawsuits. They're putting it all on the line for all of America. And you know what? They're getting treated terribly by some very anti-American forces out there. They're getting treated terribly by some very anti-America, anti-freedom people out there who are only too willing to play the government sheep game and just go along with whatever the government tells them to do and do it. And then demand that you too do it as a condition of being a good patriotic American citizen. These people who are patriots out there putting it all on the line are facing some terrible backlash, some terrible attacks from the leftists in this country who want to steal freedoms and just have government, cradle to grave, control every aspect of individual lives. So yes, America's perilous position, it's a 9 hitting out of 10. And if you don't see that, then I got to say you're part of the problem. Because if you don't see the perilous position that America is facing right now, then that means you're actually helping the enemy by not fighting. Can't afford anymore to just sit on the couch and scream back at the news when somebody says something on there that you don't like and feel as if you're contributing to society, feel as if you're putting your 2 cents out there, feel as if you're doing your job as an American. Can't even afford to just sit outside the political and cultural worlds except for voting days. It's great to go to the ballot box and vote, and if you're not doing that, then I don't even know how you can call yourself a fine, upstanding, patriotic American. But that's the basic level that you can get away with doing right now. You have to go above and beyond. We're past just voting out unconstitutional, tyrannical public servants. We're at the point now where we've got to vote them out, and we've got to actually run for those seats and win those seats ourselves. And we've got to take that hard stand by saying, you know what? This nation was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Atheists and secularists are trying to skew history by removing all things God from the public arena. Socialists, progressives even, communists, collectivists do not belong in public service. They do not belong in America. The LGBTQ agenda is evil, and it's tantamount to child abuse. If we can't take the hard stance and stand up tall and strong and say these things and actually campaign for office and run for public service seats based on these bold stances, then what chance do we have of winning back America from these very evil forces that are all too willing to just steamroll their agenda over Judeo-Christian principles? That's what's been happening for years. And so now it's time for those who know better, for those who know America's history, for those who know what America exceptionalism really is, what it's about. It's time for those to stand up and put a stop to the evil forces who want to completely destroy America from within. And my guest today, Victor Davis Hanson, and I are going to have a conversation about just this. He has just written the book, The Dying Citizen, How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. And what can you add to that, except to say, yep, that's what's happening. Victor, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
So you write in your new book, The Dying Citizen, how progressive elites, tribalism, and globalization are destroying the idea of America. That republics are not lost so much over centuries, but really more in a single decade. That sounds kind of alarming, but is the reverse true on that as well? Can you win back a republic in a decade?
That's a better question. I think it's sort of like deterrence. It's hard to create deterrence because it requires constant effort to show enemies that it would be dangerous to attack you. But something like Afghanistan can lose it very quickly. So these cultural traditions, these statues, these names of streets, these names of universities, this idea of 1776 as a cherished, a foundational date, this is all the work of prior generations. But if you'd come through like a Jacobin French revolutionary or the Robespierre and just wipe it away, you can see what happened to France afterwards, or what the Bolsheviks did to the Soviet Union. This is a different type of revolution. So I think everybody has to realize these are not progressives or Democrats that want to partake in the traditional political process. They want to change the Electoral College. They want to change the idea of 2 senators per state. They want to change the 180-year filibuster. They want to change the 50-state union. They want to change the 150-year tradition of a 9-person Supreme Court. They want an open border that should never be enforced. They want to change the demography. And they operate in the so-called administrative state as well. So you have a Mark Milley or a James Clapper or a John Brennan or an Anthony Fauci or Lois Lerner that really do feel they should have legislative, executive, and judicial power, and they're not accountable to the citizen. So it's very. I'm not trying to be alarmist, but I think this is a different type of movement that we haven't seen. Even in the 60s, it was different. In the 60s, people were throwing rocks at the Pentagon, unfortunately, or they were running into the president's office and occupying it, or they were on the street protesting the DA's decision or surrounding. Now they are the DA, and they are the college president, and they are the Pentagon. So it's a top-down, inside elite revolution, and that's kind of scary.
So what you're saying is, in your research, that there's never been, as far as you're aware, of a time in American history where it has been so perilous for the state of God-given rights, of individual liberties, because it's coming from every direction now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't want to be hyperbolic because there was the Civil War, actually, in 1861. But what's unique about this is that the issues that we're witnessing, whether it's an open border or critical race theory, or this new monetary theory of printing money, or this idea of Afghanistan just fleeing without regard to deterrence. These are not polling 50%. In fact, they're hurting Joe Biden. He's down to 38%. So there's no popular support, but he's still got an agenda that is very viable because he has network news, PBS, NPR, professional sports, entertainment, Hollywood, corporate boardroom, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and the foundations. And even though these are a minority of people, they exercise primary influence. And I think the conservatives were sort of asleep at the wheel. They just thought, the Reagan Revolution or nobody in their right mind would turn the country over to a Bernie Sanders. And in that process, these institutions were absorbed by the left. And now they often operate without popular support, but very effectively so.
I personally think, and you can respond to this, is that conservatives maybe underestimated the reality of the situation in that Democrats today, they're not like JFK, they're not even like the Bill Clinton Democrats. They actually hate America. And to me, this seems different than in past times where it was just a war over political ideas. Am I wrong in saying that?
No, I don't think you are. I don't think you're exaggerating. And I write that in The Dying Citizen, that people have to realize this is not Harry Truman, as you say. It's not JFK. It's not Bill Clinton. These are, they're not progressives. They're Jacobins, if I could use that exoteric, or maybe even Bolsheviks, or at least hyper-socialists. And they do believe in this new word they've recalibrated, equity. And it's their duty to make sure that everybody in the back end is equal as adjudicated by a small elite that are not, they're not subject to the consequences of their own ideology. And they're intent on it. And they're going to do any means necessary. And they feel that because they're morally superior, because they're for equity, then any means are justified. And they don't really worry if they storm somebody in a bathroom and film her against the law, and she happens to be a U.S. senator, or try to disrupt her on a federal aviation sanctioned flight and confront Senator Sinema, or they, tell us, as Anthony Fauci does, that he had to lie about masks or herd immunity because otherwise we were too stupid and might do the wrong thing. So this is a very perilous time because people are exercising a degree of power, and the law is so asymmetrically enforced that it's baffling. People, I hear it every day. I'm sure you do. People say, "What is going on?"
Yeah,
I can't believe this. Why are they teaching this? Why do we have to go to these workshops? What's happening in the board? This is insane.
Yep.
Is it because they want to create anarchy? Are they incompetent? Everybody seems to be baffled because it's just so bizarre.
It almost has the atmosphere of a passionate religious war. It seems to me sometimes that the left is so passionate about their cause of dismantling America that they take it to a religious level.
Well, they do, because they're not empirical. So we end up with a farce. We end up with somebody who's a billionaire like Oprah Winfrey, or a multimillionaire like Meghan Markle, or the Obamas, and they lecture us on the oppression that they're suffering. It's absurd. They're the most privileged people in the history of civilization. Or we have Phyllis Queller, the head of BLM, or the co-founder, who's a Marxist, and she sees there's nothing wrong with taking the corporate profits that have been given to the BLM cause and buying 4 houses, one of which is an all-white Topanga Canyon, and then builds a security fence around it. Or Nancy Pelosi discusses, why the country's not fair, and she's got this $100 million fortune, and she has a palazzo in Napa, and I could go on, but it's bizarre. This is a very elite, powerful group who, for a variety of psychological or political reasons, has allied themselves with the very poor, and they're at war against the middle class. They don't like the middle class. They don't like its culture. They feel it lacks the romance of the poor, but it doesn't have the sophistication of the wealthy, and they don't respect it. They make fun of it. Deplorables, clingers, chumps, dregs. They have all this vocabulary for it.
And I'm glad you just brought up the middle class, because that was the next question I wanted to talk about. In The Dying Citizen, you talk about the middle class basically being decimated and what can happen. And I'm just curious, what's your take on this last year and a half of the coronavirus crackdowns? Where has that left the middle class in America? And more importantly, where do you see the middle class coming out of this coronavirus?
It's going to be very hard. Remember, it had lost or had its average income frozen for 12 years, and then suddenly in 2017-18, middle class wages went up in real dollars. And now, given inflation, they're not going up. We know that they're going down. But more importantly, we had this strange asymmetrical quarantine where if you had a little flower shop, or you had a little shoe store, or you had a family-owned donut, you were shut down. But you could go into Walmart or Target and buy shoes or flowers or donuts, and that was okay because it was a huge corporate entity with all this power. And then we had the Zoom class, and I'm a member of them, that just stayed home because these institutions locked down, and they didn't have any commute bill. They just sat home. And I think in the space of 2 weeks, my dryer went out, my washer went out, my oven went out, and my hot water heater. And all I did is I just went on, Amazon. And then guess what? Out of nowhere appeared these really courageous people right in the middle of the pandemic that were making about $10 an hour, and they came and delivered everything. And I thought, wow, we're kind of an insect class, and we're being served by all these people that are not doing very well during the quarantine, and we're all doing very well. And that was so. And then you ditto the mandates when Dr. Fauci says, I tell you that you have to be vaccinated, and Joe Biden echoes that, says you have to be vaccinated. I'm speaking as somebody who supports vaccination, was vaccinated as soon as I could be. But when you're telling the American people, 100 million of them have had, we think, COVID, and we know now that acquired immunity is at least as good and more likely superior to vaccinated immunity. You're telling them you cannot go to a restaurant, you cannot serve in the military, you cannot be a federal employee unless you're vaccinated. And they're saying to us, okay, then if I have superior immunity and you've been vaccinated, then maybe you better go get COVID and get double indemnity the same way you're forcing me to. That's crazy. We could have easily said it's maybe inexact, but if you have a vaccination proof or you have an antibody card from a test, then either one is permissible. But we didn't do that. And why we didn't do that, I think is some kind of noble lie that we thought that it would discourage vaccinations or make people be willing to take I don't know what the reason was, but it was something that was dishonest.
You said a few minutes ago about the left being morally righteous in their own minds, and that's why the fight has gone so vicious. So if that being the case, does that just underscore what founding fathers warned us in America, that we needed to have godly people, meaning we needed to have God in the public arena in order to maintain a moral population?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not saying that all the founders were active Christians, but
right.
They were deists, and that's just a fancy word to say that they thought, whether or not they themselves were devout Christians, they thought that the Sermon on the Mount, to take an example, was helpful or necessary or critical, so there would be a natural law basis for this very complex government. In other words, people would innately know you don't harm somebody, or you don't steal from somebody, or that private property is sanctified, and then the laws would reflect that belief that people had a moral compass. And that moral compass, they felt, was based on a transcendent idea that what you're doing in this present world will somehow adjudicate how your soul will be in the next world. And I know that the left hates that, but that transcendent idea throughout history has been very important. Even if you're an atheist or agnostic, then you have to confess that it is a powerful lever or influence on people to reflect natural morality. And without it, then you're just totally dependent on reason. And we've seen what reason can do in our own case when people keep quoting science and reason, whether it's Dr. Fauci or Peter Daszak, who, gain of function research. They keep talking about science, reason, but 1,200 healthcare providers last May told us reason and science say if you're a BLM protester, you can go out and violate mask, quarantine, social distancing for the greater benefit of your mental health. So they make it up as they go, and that's not something you can worship or set a code of laws upon. There's no foundation.
And here's the thing, and I'm sure you're aware of this too. Americans are onto these big leftist deceptions now. Our eyes have been wide opened, and the real question is, how do we come out of it? What are the solutions? What can we do aside from just stand your ground and fight? I assume in the Dying Citizen you offer, without giving away the end, but you offer a few practical suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not writing a handbook, a call to arms. I'm trying to diagnose a problem and show that it's not necessarily new and it's been dealt with in the past. So what everybody needs to do is say, you know what, I know conservatives their attention goes to their family, their job, their community, their church, and they're not like leftist activists that are 360 degrees 24/7. But we're in critical times now. So you must go out and vote. And I do think there's going to be a correction in the midterm like we haven't seen even in 2010 or 1994. And I think the left knows it's coming. And I think they're desperate. And they're going to try to do everything that they can to, make sure that Election Day is an artifact and that it's basically a mail-in ballot day. So we have to be very vigilant. We have to get citizens committees to watch the polls. We need to donate, according to our station, to political candidates that reflect this worry of ours. And I think you can stop this. Had we, and I'm not trying to criticize Donald Trump, but if he had gone down to Georgia and we as a conservative movement had said, we have to win those 2 Georgia seats no matter what, we're going to not talk about the election anymore that's passed. Right now is the future. We're 1 or 2 votes away from socialism. And those 2 candidates, Purdue and Loeffler, whatever their qualifications, they had won, we would not be talking quite the degree we are now. So there are political ramifications to making bad political decisions. And the idea that 2 socialists won 2 Senate seats in Georgia is just incredible.
Yeah.
It didn't have to happen. And so I'm not just saying trust in politics because we're in a cultural war, but I think everybody, in addition to being active politically, they have to say, you know what, if you want to call me a racist or a transphobe or a homophobe, and you know that I'm not, and I know that I'm not, go ahead and do it. And I'm not going to be coward. And I know that each, according to a station, is going to be more or less vulnerable, but all of us at some point have to say, I'm getting to the point where I welcome your venom because it just reflects upon you, and it's not going to alter my adherence to a traditional America. I'm going to stand up for the national anthem, 1776 on the 4th of July. That's our national holiday and birth date. I'm sorry. Columbus was a very courageous explorer. It's tragic when 2 cultures collide, but there were things going on in the New World that were pretty pathological, and people that are indigenous in Latin America and Mexico, nobody's forcing them to go into a different paradigm in North America. That's their own choice, and they're making that choice because they're empirical. And if we just look at the world that way, I think that the academic world or the corporate world will make the necessary adjustment. I don't think they're brave people.
Right.
I think that 90% of these people put their finger in the air and say, for my own career's trajectories, I want to be on the winning side. And we haven't shown that we're going to win.
Yeah, I actually think we should just say bite me a lot more. Exactly what you laid out. If people just stood up for their principles they believed in and let the left run in fear, that would do a great deal to saving America. And, you have the wisest of words. You give people always some good things to think about. And The Dying Citizen, How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America by Basic Books. Thank you so much for coming on Bold and Blunt and talking about it with me, Victor.
Thank you for having me.
Victor Davis Hanson, one of today's most remarkable critical thinkers. He puts everything in a perspective that not only is constitutionally based, but also geared to the layperson. I mean, really, every American citizen, from grade school on up to Social Security check recipient, can understand what Victor is talking about when he speaks. One of today's greatest thinkers. Well, that's today's episode of Bold and Blunt. I want to thank you for listening. I want to remind you that if you want to hear Bold and Blunt, you can subscribe to the Washington Times Bold and Blunt platform, or you can head on over to Edify, edifi.app/podcasts, and check out Bold and Blunt there, along with all the other faith-based podcasts that this great platform, Edify, has to offer. So I leave you with this one question. Where do you see America in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years? Where do you see the state of liberties in America for the individual? Where do you see the concept of God-given rights and individualism as founding fathers envisioned it in America? The answer to that question, it depends on you. It's as simple as that. America will thrive on individual liberties if Americans concerned about the state of America's individual liberties not just fight, but demand that their individual liberties remain intact. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.